much. There was a person I wanted to introduce a little earlier this evening, and I think I saw him come in, Dr. Chris Kalaki. Where are you? Off over here. Dr. Kalaki is our newly appointed professor of theology and overseas technology at the Divinity School, and is going to be April 1st the interim academic dean at the Divinity College. Dr. Bob is stepping down from that role, and Dr. Kalaki will be there. So if you'd like to meet him after the session this evening, please feel free to do so. Tonight it's my privilege to introduce again Dr. John Auxier, and his focus is going to be the Bible and Addictions, Alcohol as a Case Study. Dr. Auxier.
Great. Wonderful to be here again with you. You know, some of you may not be aware of some of Lee's backgrounds. Coming from California, one of the good things about moving to another country is you can kind of leave the past behind. And you may not be aware that Lee is an avid hunter. And in fact, at one point he got into deep trouble down in California because he was out in the desert area there east of L.A., and he apparently shot a California condor, which is an endangered species, and then decided since it had died, he'd cook it and eat it. And of course, the rangers who were on duty in the national park there caught Lee, and they took him in to be justly treated for his damage to the environment. And Lee said to the judge, "Your Honor, I have never done anything like this before. I had this new rifle. I love hunting birds. I didn't realize this thing was so far up there. I thought it was closer. I didn't realize it had a 6-foot wingspan. I'm so sorry." And the judge had mercy on Lee and said, "Well, I'll tell you what, Dr. McDonald, seeing as how you are a theologian and a pastor, I'm going to give you a break, but I'll tell you this, if you ever come before my bench again for an environmental charge, I'm going to throw the book at you." Lee was suitably grateful for that, and as he began to leave the courtroom, the judge said, "And by the way, what does California condor taste like?" And Lee stopped there at the door and he said, "Well, Your Honor, it's kind of a cross between bald eagle and whooping crane." Now, it's wonderful to see this turnout. It looks larger than it was yesterday. Now, that either means that you spread the word about how terrific last night's session was, or else it's a sign of a mob gathering for lynching. But it's great to see all the smiling faces out there, new faces here. Now, we did a lot last night, but there were still a few things that remained in the handout that we gave out. And I don't know how many people have theirs with them. Okay, there's a fair amount of you. I apologize to some of you if you don't have last night's handout. I'm going to be referring to it just to make sure that we kind of cover some bases there. We're going to be going till about 9 o'clock. At 9 o'clock, I'll give you a chance to run away, all right? And we might take a couple more minutes if we can after that. But at 9 o'clock, I'm going to give you a break and let you run off. I just want to touch base quickly on page 3 of last night's handout before we move into tonight's material. We have a ton of stuff to cover tonight, as you can see from your outline as well. Page 3 in last night's outlines was underlying. We talked about the mystery of addiction, but we didn't talk about underlying factors that can feed addiction. So let's just briefly touch base on this. First one is abuse and trauma. What happens to a person who is traumatized is that they take the trauma and it has hurt them so bad that it creates a lot of negative feelings about themselves. They may feel guilt and shame. They may feel worthless. There are all sorts of terrible feelings. They may feel afraid. And so in order to deal with those feelings, later on, they may learn that drugs and alcohol relieve some of those feelings, or masturbation and pornography relieves that feeling, or maybe getting involved with a VLT relieves that feeling, takes me away from that. And so sometimes for some folks with addictions, what's going on for them is they're using the substance or behavior to self-medicate for trauma. And so in the long run, that may be an underlying issue that you have to look at that they need to get help for. On the front end, when they're first stopping, usually you don't want to get into the trauma issues because they may be just too powerful and are going to destabilize the person. And I feel like I'm echoing a little bit, so you may want to turn it down just a tad. So that's one of the factors that's an underlying factor. Another one can be a mood disorder. And again, it's similar to the self-medication idea. You might have a mood disorder of some sort, and because you're depressed, you try to take something to counteract that depression. It may be the opposite thing that makes you feel even worse. So I'm depressed, so I think I'll have a drink. Well, of course, drinking is going to depress you further. It deepens your depression rather than helps you. But there's a part of it that somehow eases some of the pain, but actually deepens the malady. So an underlying mood disorder is often the case. We know, for example, with compulsive gamblers, they are not only compulsive gamblers, but they are also often depressed and suicidal. About 6% of suicides in Canada are due to gambling or related to gambling. And about 200 people a year kill themselves from that. So depression and addiction go hand in hand, and sometimes you can't tell which one started the other. And so that may be an underlying issue, or it may be caused by the addiction itself. And then there are personality disorders that are associated with addictions. And although there was a search for the addictive personality in the 80s, it's pretty clear from the research, sorry to alert you to this, but there is no such thing actually as an addictive personality per se. That came out of kind of a folklore of treatment that said that all alcoholics are a certain way and kind of stereotyped people with addictions. Actually, all the studies on people with addictions show that they're pretty much a cross-section of different types of personalities. There is one factor that might be a factor that sets you up, and that is impulsivity. And that's a factor we can kind of call a trait factor that's long-lasting. But apart from that, generally speaking, there isn't one particular version of the addictive personality. They look a lot like you and me. Now, we also do know that there are certain types of personality disorders that are drawn to addictions and will tend to have that often as one of the symptoms in the cluster. Example of that would be borderline personality disorder. Those folks, one of the symptoms that's common with them is being involved with an addiction. It's not true for all of them, but for many of them. Antisocial personality disorder as well. And then in our discussion today, we talked about, at the church during our kind of talk back discussion, we talked about how folks with schizophrenia and other chronic mental illnesses sometimes will have addictions that probably are a form of self-medication. There's so many things going on for them in their heads. They're trying to do something to calm themselves down, but instead they get trapped, in addition to having their problem with schizophrenia, into a whole nother world of problems called addiction. And then finally, lack of experience with sobriety is a factor sometimes in people's recovery. If a person began using drugs and alcohol as a main coping device very early in life, they really might not have had much experience living sober. And if that's the case, when you're trying to help them get sober, it's a challenge for them because it's quite scary for them to try to face life on its own terms, as AA would say, without drugs or alcohol, because they have no time they can look back to where they are ever successful without using drugs and alcohol. So many times those folks are particularly at high rate of relapse risk when you're working with them to help them. So understanding some of these factors can sometimes help you if you're dealing with a person who's troubled or challenged by an addiction as you're trying to reach out and help them. There's also a list of recommendations here about how the church can help, and this is what the whole conference is about, if you would. So I think it's important to note some of these. First is talking about substance abuse and other addictions from the pulpit to reduce the stigma of addiction in the church. And, for example, find somebody who's a Christian in the community or in your church who has recovered from an addiction who'd be willing to share their story. That would be an awesome testimony to God's grace and also might give hope to somebody else who's secretly struggling but afraid to talk about it. And if not that, at least you can preach on a theme that relates from Scripture about the hope that people who are stuck in the struggle with addiction can find in Christ. Also, become a church where the grace of God is preached and practiced. If people believe that they can be loved in spite of their flaws and shortcomings, then that's a church where people are going to really work on the true things that are going on, the hidden things that are going on, including maladies such as addictions. Practice authenticity in your preaching and small group ministries. Some of the clients, particularly couples that I've worked with that have had the greatest recovery, have been folks who have been part of a meaningful small group in their church in addition to getting professional counseling or going to other meetings. Because when they're able to go to a small group and say, I'm addicted to cocaine and I don't know what to do about it. Even if some of the other church members don't know much about addiction and have never been exposed to it, if they're caring people and they're willing to be transparent and authentic with them, they're a great support and they can encourage each other and be a great boost to a person or a couple who are struggling with such problems. So if we can foster authenticity from the pulpit and in our small group ministries, I think it's very powerful for helping. Also, network with your local ministerial for pastoral care of addicted parishioners. That may mean locating all sorts of self-help groups, whether it be 12-step type groups or more explicitly Christian groups like Alcoholics Victorious or Celebrate Recovery or Overcomers Anonymous or some of those groups as well. Invite Christian treatment programs to come and share their ministry on a Sunday. You have Teen Challenge here that's out of Halifax. How many of you have ever had Teen Challenge come and share in one of your services? Okay, I would really encourage you to do that. I know that for myself, I had personal friends, and a woman who was a graduate of the counseling program that I directed, whose son was a heroin addict, and they were at their wits' end. And at their church, they went to an Alliance church. Teen Challenge team came in. The men who came, who were in the program, came and sang, gave testimonies. And they talked about the treatment program that might be available for their son. And the next week, their son finally came to them and said, "I've got to get help, Mom. I've got to get help, Dad. I've got to do something." And they said, we know exactly where we want to take you. And so he got into Teen Challenge within a week. And it was a life-changing experience. He became a Christian through the program, spent a year in kind of a discipleship model of recovery. And he's had struggles, but considering he's coming out of heroin addiction, he's doing marvelously. So I just encourage you, if there are probably other ministries that run by the Salvation Army, other groups that may be reaching out to this population, and I just encourage you, bring them in the church, let them speak, and let them become a resource for the folks who are in the pew. And then pastors should seek training in the basics of addictions. We've talked about that yesterday, and again, Carol Ann has mentioned it. Our brother just came up and led us in prayer. It's a wonderful thing that ADC has a tradition in this area and continues it to enable pastors to learn and understand how to help folks with addictions. And plus, you've asked a renowned expert such as myself to come and deliver these lectures. Lastly, I really encourage you as pastors, for those of you who are in the ministry, to develop a referral notebook where you keep information about various types of recovery groups, along with the other kind of information that you gather. One of the assignments I give when I teach pastoral counseling at ACT seminaries back in British Columbia is to require all my students to develop a big, thick notebook of community resources of all sorts that can help them when people are coming in crisis for additional pastoral care. And so I really encourage you to make use of the pamphlets and other things, hold on to them that are given by, there's OA pamphlets out there, NA pamphlets, other ministries, AA, and other fellowships, and so on. Make sure you pick up one of those and that you put it in a notebook or a place where you can get access to it. The next time somebody knocks on your door and says, my child is off the rails with drugs and alcohol, or I've got this kind of a problem that's an addiction-like problem, where can I get help? And that's a great time to have somebody to call up and say, for example, one individual I've met here specializes in gambling care. Well, you guys ought to get his number, because you ought to pick up the phone next time you run into somebody who's struggling with gambling and say, what do I do? Are there some programs near us? And so on. Those are the kind of resources I encourage you to collect, and so forth. And then finally, there's kind of three areas when you think about treatment for addiction problems. You think about prevention, intervention, and recovery support. And so prevention is mentioned there. There's a great program that's put out by Focus on the Family called Drug Proofing Your Kids, DPYK. You might check out the Focus Canada webpage. It's an outstanding curriculum. It can be run in schools. It's not explicitly Christian, but it has kind of Christian philosophy underneath it. But it's excellent, and it's really a good parent education program, how to build a good relationship with your child so that they are protected from the temptation, involvement in drugs. Interventions are listed in here, such as learning about motivational enhancement, which I think we'll be looking at tomorrow. Get basic screening skills to help seekers self-assess. That'll be a part of the motivational enhancement in interviewing material tomorrow. Learning to work with ambivalence, which, again, we'll talk about tomorrow. And then be knowledgeable about addiction dynamics in families. We've touched on it briefly yesterday about the kinds of impact that addictions tend to have, so you can understand why families are operating the way they are and what needs to be reset and what are the struggles that they need to face and work through. And then be familiar, as again, with the resources in your community for referral, for detox, and so on. Recovery support is kind of the third piece, and I just encourage you to be open to establishing support groups across a good spectrum. There's lots of good 12-step groups, and you can network with those. There's also Christian groups, as I've mentioned before. Support groups for addiction to pornography are an area that many churches are showing increasing interest in and is a vital area. I was just talking to somebody else who's a pastor, and I've talked to seminary educators across Canada. This is true at our seminary as well. Lots of our seminarians struggle with these kinds of issues. Pornography is in your face, and it's right there today. It's easy for you to start taking these kind of mental vacations into that land, and the next thing you know, you're using up hours of time or beginning to get involved in more serious types of activity that are really damaging to your integrity and undermine your relationship with the Lord and undermine your relationship with your spouse. So those kinds of groups, I just encourage you to pursue and investigate and think about. Along those lines, Carol Ann has reproduced, I think, about a 6-page bibliography, something like that I have for you for resources in terms of books and websites on substance abuse counseling and pornography counseling in particular, and sexual addiction. There's a few websites on there about gambling, but it's a little light on the gambling side. But particularly sexual addiction, pornography addiction, and substance abuse, there's some good resources. And so I'm going to give that out tomorrow night, and we'll kind of go over some of that and give you some recommendations about top resources to think about and so on. And there's also a page in there of books that I have found helpful from any mental health professionals that are here, that are part of our time, so that you might find that interesting to see some recommendations there for you as well. And so now I think we're caught up, and we can probably go home now. So we may yet be referring. There's actually a couple more sheets on that page that have some good information. So we might look back at them as we go through some material here that relates to that. But let's talk tonight first about the Bible and alcohol, and then we're going to talk about the 5 relationships that is a way I try to use to kind of structure my thinking theologically about pastoral care and about addictions. And then we'll also look at a question of are addicts, victims, or sinners. We're not going to have time to look at that too much. It's a great question, but I'm going to recommend a book if you have further interest in it. It's just there's so much material we're trying to cover. I can't do everything I would wish I could do. And then of internal and external issues that a person's facing. So to kind of get you into the mind and the reality of a person who's addicted. And I'm hoping we'll be able to talk about some of the dynamics so you have a little bit better understanding of this idea of addiction as its attachment, this romance that you can't get out of, this neural pathway that's gotten a lot of power over a person, and those kinds of ideas that we've talked about. And then the last portion of our time, we are going to talk about AA and the 12 steps and do an appreciative critique of the 12-step tradition. So let's start by running through some passages on the Bible and alcohol. And what I'm going to show on the screen are simply Bible passages, and I'm going to make some comments to you as we go along the way. And so we won't camp out on all of these verses and so on, but we will try to kind of hit the high points and bring out some key points here about what the Bible says about alcohol. Because after all, it's not as if the Bible is completely quiet about the issue of how do you manage intoxication. The first part we want to talk about, assuming that's on there, yes, is the misuse of alcohol. Now, can everybody see that okay? Do you need the lights turned out on this where I am? Okay, we're okay? All right. I'm going to start out with this verse, actually, from the New Testament. These verses, Romans 13, 12 through 14. Paul is writing here. He says, "The night is nearly over, the day is almost here, so let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave decently as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourselves with the Lord Jesus Christ and do not think about how to gratify the desires of your sinful nature." And so there's lots you could say here. This is a rich passage. But we're going to just note right at the outset that it's pretty clear from both the Old and the New Testament that drunkenness is not seen as a godly way of life. In fact, it's often grouped in lists of very harmful types of behaviors in the Scripture that are to be avoided. So we know that, but we're just checking and taking a new look at what the Bible says and reminding ourselves that the Scriptures say that drunkenness itself is actually a very bad thing, something to be avoided if at all possible. In Genesis 9, 20 through 27, we get a great example, and we're going to just run through some key examples of how alcohol is presented both in story and in commandment in the Scriptures. This passage tells the story of Noah who, following the flood, plants a vineyard, drinks wine, then becomes drunk, collapses in his tent, he's naked. In their culture, to be exposed to your children was a great sign of humiliation and would totally violate your credibility in the patriarchal family system of the day. And so in the midst of this episode of binge drinking by Noah, it says that his son Ham, who's the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers. And the point is here is that Ham is seen as someone who came along, found his father inebriated, drunk, exposed in this way, which was very, very culturally taboo, and mocked him, essentially, by looking at him. In contrast, his other brothers, Shem and Japheth, took the garment and laid it across their shoulders, and when they walked in backwards and covered their father's nakedness because they did not want to humiliate their father, and they did not want to create problems in the family. But when Noah woke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, mocking him in his nakedness, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brother." And so here you have Noah, a great figure in the Old Testament, actually pronouncing a curse on his grandson. It's a tragic point, but I think it points out, and we could talk about, well, who was enabling Noah or whatever, and we certainly wouldn't want to do that kind of thing. We don't know if Noah is regularly doing this or not. We have limited information here. We don't know if it's just a binge or a pattern or whatever. So we've got to be careful about going too far with it. And we certainly wouldn't condone enabling behavior where people get to do things and then there's no consequences, because we know that consequences are really a good thing, and it's kind of God's system of teaching us how to do things well and do what's right. But in this case, if nothing else, this episode points out that when particularly a parent or significant figure is out of control with alcohol, it can upset the entire family system. In this case, it had devastating effects because Noah's own response is somewhat vicious, it seems like. And so you just begin to see just the notion of how a family life can get twisted up. A second passage I'd like to look at with you briefly is Genesis 19, 30 through 38. This is the story of Lot. If you know the story of Lot, Lot and his family lived in Sodom and Gomorrah. They fled the city under the guidance of some angels. They barely got out of town before destruction was rained down on those twin cities. And then what happened is Lot goes into the mountains and he settles in a place called Zoar. And he's in a cave there, and his daughters say in this passage, in essence, look, we have no chance to ever have children or a family now. We've lost everything. We've ruined everything. We're just stuck here with our father. And then they plot and they plan. They say, let's get him drunk. If we can get him drunk, we'll get pregnant. We'll have children. Now, biblical scholars would say there's maybe an agenda here to make the Moabites, I think, look like a bad offspring who come out of incestuous relationship. But apart from that caveat, what you see there is a great picture of how under the influence, and Lot is not fully aware of what's going on, but under the influence, he does things that he would probably never do if he hadn't been drinking. And we know, for example, as I mentioned before, there's a great deal of child abuse occurs under the influence of alcohol or drugs. And that creates chains of disastrous problems later on. Now, there should be a proviso with this particular example, is that in the case of incest, there's virtually no time when a parent is irresponsible and it's the children seeking sexual relations, as it is in this story. So this story is completely not in line with what you understand about child abuse in homes today. All right, so granting that, understanding that is important. We wouldn't want to draw a conclusion about that. But nonetheless, we see that the fact that Lot allowed himself to get under the influence lowered his inhibitions, and he participated at some fashion in this incestuous relationship. As I mentioned before, trauma then gets passed down in families through this kind of activity under the influence. I can think of one of my clients who came to me. She was about 25, a single mom, recently divorced, one child. In her family system, her mom and dad never married. Her dad was out of the picture. She had a couple of stepfathers. They were okay. They weren't abusive, but they weren't very big in her life. Her mother began to develop some drinking problems off and on and largely was checked out. Her grandmother kind of raised her. When she was about 8 years old, some neighbors down the street began to take an interest in her, and then they began to give her alcohol and sexually abuse her. And so from the time she was 8, she began drinking regularly. By the time she was 10 or 12 in elementary school, she was bringing alcohol to school and drinking heavily. By the time she was 14, she was on the streets, selling her body, taking every kind of drug possible. She was a prostitute on and off. And this is a person who also became a Christian sometime in her teenage years in the middle of this chaotic disaster. By the time I saw her in her mid-20s, she had been in and out of treatment numerous times and was still mightily struggling with addiction to alcohol, to marijuana, and to heroin. And she was trying to be a good mother, but continually would relapse. One of the things that made it very difficult to work with her was the fact that she had been traumatized as a young person by other people who were using drugs. And the result of that was that it was very difficult to get anywhere with her addiction because she kept drinking and using to deal with those long-standing, unresolved traumatic events. And so when we see things like the story of Lot, it just reminds us that alcohol and abuse and things like incest go hand in hand, as do other drugs as well. Proverbs 20, verse 1, wine is a mocker and beer is a brawler. Whoever is led astray by them is not wise. Again, wine is a mocker reminds you of the situation with Noah. And of course, we all know what it's like running into somebody who's been heavily drinking. And we've seen you see all the movies, particularly old movies from the 30s and 40s, that has the kind of the happy, silly drunk. That they're just kind of a clown and you just laugh at them. But actually, being high, being drunk, causes a person to be mocked, loses self-respect, loses credibility with other people. I can think about a mentor of mine that I grew up with in Young Life, which is a ministry that played a big role in bringing me to Christ. And he said one of the reasons that he has chosen as a Christian not to drink was because of his family experiences with his uncle. And his uncle would come over and be completely soused and urinate in the living room, lose control of his bladder because he was so heavily under the influence and so on. And so my good friend who was my mentor said that basically he didn't want anything to do with alcohol, having seen the negative effects of it in his own family system, having seen a person lose all self-respect, self-control through that. So wine is a mocker. It mocks us when it becomes a significant addictive factor in our life. And beer is a brawler. Whoever's led astray by them is not wise. There's a strong relationship between particularly alcohol and violence, as I've said before. And so that's one of the advantages of marijuana is at least you tend not to load your shotgun and or get a knife out or start a fist fight if you're smoking weed. You might go to sleep and be real mellow, but at least you won't try to kill somebody. But there's a strong affinity, particularly with alcohol and violence. And of course, we know in the case of stimulants, cocaine and particularly crystal methamphetamine, at high doses, crystal meth, chronically taken, produces psychotic paranoia that can lead to some ghastly crimes. It's not necessarily typical of all meth addicts, but it certainly is one of the things that we'll read about in the paper occasionally as people become so strung out on it that they lose all track of what's reality, and they also become hyper-aggressive as well. Proverbs 23, verses 20 and 21. Do not join those who drink too much wine or gorge themselves on meat, for drunkards and gluttons become poor, and drowsiness clothes them in rags. I'll just make a couple of quick comments about this. Do not join those who drink too much wine or gorge themselves on meat. I think that the writer of these verses is not saying that you have nothing absolutely to do with folks who are struggling with problems, but don't join in with them. Don't participate in their addiction with them. Sometimes that's what happens. If you have a husband and wife and one of them is addicted, sometimes in scenarios I've seen, the spouse who is not addicted after a while says, look, I wonder what this is all about. I feel left out. So they start to drink or use with their other mate who's addicted. And it's a way of joining with them. It's a way of being together. It's a way of trying to form and save an attachment with them. But of course, it leads to further and further disaster. One of the things that happens with crystal methamphetamine is that sometimes husbands or boyfriends will use crystal methamphetamine with a girlfriend or their wife because it's supposed to enhance their sexual relationship. And then the next thing that goes on is that perhaps the husband or the boyfriend doesn't get hooked, but the woman gets hooked. And then she begins to be obsessed with meth, and it begins to take over her life in a way that he didn't even intend. But the scriptures are warning us about that. We also know in studies of college students, you can predict which college students are going to be at risk to become lifetime problem drinkers or who are engaged in problem drinking currently by taking a poll about how many of their friends drink heavily. There's a real solid correlation between people who have problem drinking going on in college years and the social network that they're in. If they don't have many friends that don't drink, it's unlikely they're going to be a problem drinker themselves. Conversely, if almost all their friends drink heavily, they're much more at risk for developing a problem themselves. So Proverbs is correct as it warns us, do not join those who drink too much or gorge themselves on meat, for drunkards and gluttons become poor, and drowsiness clothes them in rags. We also get the observation here about not just a substance problem as an addiction, but the suggestion here is overeating could be viewed and lumped together sometimes as an addiction. Now, I personally, having been overweight at times, am quite sensitive to that connection. But there certainly is, for those of us who always have struggled with maintaining our weight and so on. I lost about 50 pounds a couple of years ago. It feels very much like a compulsion. It feels very stuck, doesn't it, if you've ever tried it. Anybody here ever try to lose weight? And so we get this connection here too, don't we? So without unnecessarily stigmatizing folks who may be a little heavier than they wish, we sometimes can see that with certain types of overeating problems. And then it also talks about how both drunkards and gluttons become poor, and drowsiness clothes them in rags. One of the things that happens to a person if they become severely addicted or severely dependent is they begin to have losses pile up. And those losses become greater and greater as they go along. And so you get kind of a poetical reference to that end product of being stuck in an addiction, I think, in these verses. Now, if you want to pull out quickly your handout from yesterday, again, and you want to look at the... If you look at the next to last page, it says typical progress of an addiction. Typical progress of an addiction. This is from yesterday's handout. on the top side, and it says domains of substance abuse impact and behaviors. You see that and again, we're trying to think about substance abuse problems as existing on a continuum, correct? Not necessarily just a straight yes, no, you have it or not, but on a bit of a continuum. So the early stage is experimental social use. So there's very few consequences there. At that point in the experimental stage, people are learning the mood effects. If I do this, I take this, it feels good. They move into the second stage, which is seeking it. So instead of just kind of being aware of that, and it's nice when it happens, but it's not a big deal, they begin to be more conscious about saying, boy, I really need a drink. I really would, or I'd like to light up and just check out, or whatever it might be. And they often then will begin to make some subtle changes about who they're hanging with. Their thoughts tend to be running more towards the addictive substance or behavior at that time. But they're basically still in the process of learning to use and improve their mood by using chemicals and other things. We're talking about that neural pathway getting set in place, isn't it? It's starting a little bit. There's been road construction to build that addictive pathway to the limbic part of your brain. And the conscious forebrain is getting a little bit neglected during that seeking the mood swing stage. And then you have the abuse level. That would be the DSM-4 type of criteria that I shared with you, where they begin to have more significant types of problems. They might neglect an important family obligation because they were using, and so they were so distracted from that they forgot to go to grandmother's birthday party. Or they got hung over, so they keep calling in at work. So they're beginning to have a few problems like that. Or maybe they're driving drunk. Now, oftentimes you drive drunk, you don't get caught. If you get caught driving drunk, usually it means you were probably driving drunk 20 times. You didn't get caught. But again, from isolated events over the course of a year, one or two of those would qualify you for beginning to develop a problem, which would be labeled an abuse problem. And then level 4, you have dependence set in. And that's where the losses come in that start to mount up. And within dependence itself, there's probably a range. Not everybody who's dependent is as severely dependent as others. But that's where you kind of begin to cross over into that true addiction category, where this is really becoming a life-dominating, serious problem. And the DSM-4 criteria that are attached to yesterday's handout can help you understand some of those things. Some of the things that happen to you then as you begin to develop tolerance, for example, at that stage. And that means that you need more of the substance or behavior to get the same effect. So whereas before, when you first snorted cocaine, it just felt fantastic, and it lasted, let's say, 12 minutes. But now, when you're snorting cocaine, it seems to be lasting 5 minutes. And you've got to keep snorting. When you first started injecting cocaine, it seemed to last a good 10, 15 minutes. Now it's seeming to last, you're injecting yourself every 5 minutes. And you're doing that all night to try to recapture the high that you had. It used to be when you first started drinking, 3 beers was a buzz. And now it's taken you 6 beers or 8 beers. So what's happening is your body's adapted, and so you've built tolerance. The second thing that happens, too, is that when you stop using, and if you're at the dependence type of level, you really notice it, because your body's gotten so used to having the substance there that it's actually adapted. So to feel normal, you have to have the substance, or you have to be engaged in the behavior. If you don't have the substance in your body starts to kind of scream a little bit, starts to get itchy, starts to get anxious. And if you're really dependent, you can have some fairly substantial symptoms that are quite painful. And we all know, for example, when you withdraw from alcohol, you might have delirium tremens, for example, where you'd have terrible hallucinations. It's not necessarily a standard thing that everybody has, but sometimes that's an extreme sign of withdrawal symptoms. Or you'd get the shakes, things like that. Also, then, you have increasingly abandonment of important roles. So instead of just having accidentally missed something because of your using, you're starting to regularly miss something all the time. And you're losing that role of father, husband, brother, sister, student, worker, pastor, whatever your role is. It's actually being sacrificed for the addiction. And preoccupation is a real sign of this stage too, that you're spending a lot of time thinking about the drug or getting ready to use the drug or trying to find money to use the drug or preparing or hiding it, or all those things put together. And so it becomes increasingly life-dominating. And again, the criteria are laid out more clearly on the handout elsewhere. When we think about substance abuse as a problem, just to throw this in since we're talking about some of the effects, we have down here domains of substance abuse impact and behaviors. And so when you're trying to help a person understand if they have a problem, you might want to say, well, have you ever had any legal problems because of your using? You say you don't have a problem, but you're thinking about maybe, at least you're talking to me about it. Have you ever had a problem legally because of using? Well, yes. I got arrested down in Kentville for getting into a fight at a bar. Okay, well, that's interesting. And how's your money going? How much money are you spending a week on alcohol? And so on. And walking through these life areas can sometimes give that person a sense of what's going on. Are there losses accumulating for them? And that's a basic part of assessment. You might want to bring that with you tomorrow when we talk about motivational interviewing, because assessment can be very helpful when you're trying to help people move away from an addiction and discover reasons to change. Proverbs 23, 29 through 35. Great passage on alcohol in the Old Testament. The writer of Proverbs says, who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who has complaints? Who has needless bruises? Who has bloodshot eyes? Those who linger over wine, who go to sample bowls of mixed wine. Do not gaze at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a snake and poisons like a viper. It's a great analogy to the trap of addiction to alcohol, isn't it? And we've already mentioned, as we've just really covered some of that high end of problems, that addiction end, that dependence end, the things we've just chatted about are things that are truly woes. When you begin to lose your marriage or relationship because of your use of crack or involvement with alcohol, or because you've withdrawn from really having intimacy because you're become so involved in the fantasy world of pornography. It creates woes. It creates sorrows in your family as your children see you in the state of intoxication and not operating as a responsible parent. It creates sorrow as they have to mourn someone who perhaps has taken their life because they've been under the influence or perhaps driven drunk and hurt somebody else. Who has complaints, needless bruises. The chances of having an accident are much greater on the workplace than when you are under the influence. We have, in fact, a news article last month in the Vancouver Sun was talking about how the major person in charge of working with forestry labor has come out publicly and said that drugs and alcohol, and particularly marijuana, are actually starting to play a significant role in producing a record number of on-the-job injuries in the forestry industry in BC now. Who has bruises? Who has bloodshot eyes? The Scriptures are talking about the same things we observe medically today. Alcohol's just about the oldest drug around. We're still seeing the same symptoms that our Old Testament writers talk about. There's additional statements here that are even really fit well with the notion of physical withdrawal that I just mentioned before. Verse 33 out of this passage says, your eyes will see strange sights and your mind imagine confusing things. And those of you who've come out of a life of alcoholism, you can probably say, yes, that's true. That's what it was like. If you've known anybody close to you who has been under the influence of alcohol and been troubled by the addiction, you've also observed that as they have gotten strange ideas or seen hallucinations or other types of phenomena such as delirium tremens. You'll be like one sleeping on the high seas, lying on top of the rigging. And if you see somebody go through withdrawal from alcohol in particular, but it's true, of course, even of other substances. We think of heroin and the kind of painful withdrawal syndrome associated with that. It's a great metaphor for going through withdrawal, sleeping on the high seas, lying on the top of a rigging. Not a very comfortable place to be when you're going through withdrawal. They hit me, you will say, but I'm not hurt. They beat me up, but I don't feel it. When will I wake up so I can find another drink? People, when you're under the influence, many times you might do things that would have just knocked you for a loop otherwise, but because of the anesthetic properties of using drugs or alcohol, we think PCP, or angel dust as it used to be called, for example. People could do fairly amazing feats of strength and fight police officers and other kinds of folks in the medical services who are trying to assist them without responding at all to physical restraint because they were so numbed out. Again, the Scripture's kind of talking about the same kinds of effects that we actually see today on the street. And when will I wake up so I can find another drink really speaks to the craving, the psychological craving that often accompanies addictions to substances. Proverbs 23, 29 to 35. Oops, and I went back the wrong way. Proverbs 31, 4 through 4. 4 through 7. Just a quick mention on this one. It says this: "It's not for kings, O Lemuel, not for kings to drink wine, not for rulers to crave beer, lest they drink and forget what the law decrees and deprive all the oppressed of their rights." And there, he's not really prohibiting the king from drinking wine or beer, because it's clear from other passages that was a common practice, and in fact it was not seen in any negative way per se. But he is saying, the implication is probably more about drunkenness, and it's saying that the king should not allow himself to get out of control with alcohol because he has important role responsibilities. And once again, we see that as one of the areas of life domains that happens to people when they begin to abuse drugs or alcohol or other addictive behaviors, that their life becomes dominated by it, and it causes them to neglect significant roles, being it mother, father, being it pastor, employee, being it husband, or being it wife. It says, "Give beer to those who are perishing, wine to those who are in anguish. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more." That's actually kind of a curious and interesting kind of a statement about alcohol. And we're going to come back to that because there's actually one of the uses in the Bible that's recommended for alcohol is some kind of medicinal type of remedy for folks who may need a special relief from pain. Let's then move into that subject, and that is the Bible and alcohol, responsible uses. Psalm 104, 14 through 15 says this, and this is a great passage that talks about alcohol, and not just drunkenness, but alcohol in general. And it refers to God, and it says, "He makes grass grow for the cattle and plants for man to cultivate, bringing forth food from the earth." So it's talking about God's provision for humankind and what God has done in His providence and how He cares about humanity and how He takes care of us. And then He says, "He makes wine that gladdens the heart of man, and oil to make his face shine, and bread that sustains his heart." And what these verses are referring to is the fact that God has apparently provided wine as one of the kinds of foods and blessings that He's given to humankind to enjoy. So, although it's pretty clear by example and also by precept that drunkenness is seen as a disaster socially, personally, and spiritually in the Bible, we also see that, at least in this passage, and we'll see it in others, that apparently alcohol properly used is not frowned upon by biblical writers. Isaiah 55, 1 and 2. The prophet says, "Come, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come and buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread, and your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me and eat what is good, and your soul will delight in the richest of fare." Now, obviously this isn't meant specifically to be a salesman for the use of wine. It's talking about God's grace, and it's saying He's appealing to His people who have fallen away from Him to come and receive His grace. But the imagery of receiving His grace is about receiving food from the hand of God the Father. It's about receiving blessings. And so, along with grain and oil, wine in biblical times was seen as a legitimate part of their life and a food, if you would, for the table that was a representative blessing of God. We see in John chapter 2, on the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. How many people have heard this story before? And so we could follow this story, but we know the story that Jesus' mother said, we have a problem. They're running out of wine. Can you do something about it? Jesus first is reluctant, and then he, of course, transforms canisters of water into delicious wine, and is particularly delicious and rich, and is even commented upon by the master of ceremonies, who doesn't realize that there's a miracle that's taken place. Again, not necessarily saying let's go out and drink wine, but certainly testifies to the reality of the biblical testimony in the biblical world, that wine was seen as a legitimate food and was seen as a legitimate part of life that could be used properly or improperly. In Luke chapter 23:36, I just throw this verse in. It reminds us of that verse we saw earlier, where it talked about kind of give wine to those who are in pain and in need of it, and so on. A good New Testament application of that is where Jesus is dying on the cross, and the soldiers came up and mocked him. And they offered him wine and vinegar and said, "If you're the King of Jews, save yourself." Well, of course, they were despicable characters, but at least the offering of wine or soured vinegar was an attempt to offer him something to relieve some of his pain. And that really matches back to what the Proverbs passage we saw earlier would say about the legitimate use, perhaps, of a wine in those days. 1 Timothy 5:22 through 23, do not be hasty in the laying on of hands, do not share in the sins of others, keep yourself pure. And then right after that, Paul says, stop drinking only water and use little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illness. Now, I have real Canadian natural spring water up here, and I think I'm going to stick with water tonight. Seeing as how this is a Baptist gathering, and seeing as how I don't drink at all anyhow, but we have Paul making a clear statement that there may be a legitimate place for an occasional glass of wine. Of course, we have some medical evidence now that maybe a glass of wine a day, a modest amount. Sometimes when you're working with people that have problems with alcohol, they say, well, I just had 2 glasses of wine. Well, they were each 30 ounces. You have to ask the second question to how big was the glass, which is a good follow-up. But again, what we know is in terms of some positive health effects, possibly in the cardiopulmonary area, as a prophylactic. So there are some benefits with responsible use and care. Isaiah 28:7 and 8. And let's see. That's verses out of that verse is out of sequence, so we're just going to jump to Romans 14 here. And here you have Paul talking, where he does several times in the New Testament, the problem of meat offered to idols, and about what is good Christian conduct, and along with that is mentioned the issue of should people drink or not drink wine. And of course, wine offerings were also made to pagan deities as well. And the difficulty is that there are a lot of new believers in the communities that Paul's writing to, and some of them were very troubled because if Christians went to the marketplace, and the marketplace was also nearby where animals were sacrificed to various pagan deities at various chapels and altars. And then once the sacrifice was made to Aphrodite or to somebody else, then that animal would be brought by the priests or their servants to the marketplace to be sold, because that was one of the ways that those pagan outfits made money to sustain themselves. And then Christians had serious questions coming out of paganism. Is it okay to eat a piece of meat that had originally been sacrificed in the name of some false god? Very serious question. They're trying to live with integrity. They don't want to support that pagan system anymore. They want to do what's right. And so Paul's trying to help the Romans just like he's trying to help the Corinthian community with this problem. And so he tries to resolve it more or less by coming up with a principle that is probably tougher for us because it's not a clear yes-no binary answer. He says all food is clean. So he's really saying there's nothing wrong with the meat that was offered to idols, if you would. But it's wrong for a man to eat anything that causes someone else to stumble. So it's better not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything else that will cause your brother to fall. And so the principle that Paul seems to be espousing in this passage and the other passage in 1 Corinthians would probably be best summarized that you may have liberty to do certain things, but there are circumstances where it is better to choose not to exercise your liberty, lest you cause genuine temptation and problems for somebody else. Now, this is Joe Aldrich, who was a very conservative Bible college president at Multnomah in the 80s, wrote a great book called Lifestyle Evangelism that kind of got that phrase into our language as evangelicals. He commented on this passage, and he said the problem with this passage is sometimes there are folks in churches who are professional weaker brothers who are constantly offended or claim to be caused to stumble by all sorts of behaviors. And so therefore they say nobody should be able to do X, Y, and Z, even if it's not prohibited by Scripture. And so he says that's not what this is talking about. This is somebody who's actually truly potentially compromised by your behavior. And in those circumstances, you ought to be careful about what you do. And so in the case of alcohol, it's not so much the issue about whether it's clear from biblical practice and teaching, drunkenness is condemned, but not necessarily responsible use. But it's clear that there are times when it's best to abstain out of respect for somebody else who might genuinely be tempted to relapse or have a problem with it. Now, I could think of that being the case where, and again, I don't drink anything, never have. Okay, I'm a teetotaler. But I could think that if I were at a gathering and I had somebody who was trying to recover from an addiction, I might want to say, at this gathering we're not going to serve alcohol right now because I know my brother Joe is early in his recovery and it's hard for him to be around alcohol right now. So out of deference to him, we're not going to do that. That, I think, is in the spirit of what Paul's talking about here. And so it's harder for us because we'd much rather have a rule that was said, okay, it's just this way. But Paul's actually making us think more about what is actually happening. So we have to make an ethical decision, not just a decision based on a command. So lastly, on this topic, I'd like to talk a little bit about intoxication as a kind of shadow spirituality. And we mentioned before that I would say one metaphor, one idea about addiction is that it operates as a deep attachment. And I talked about how it's a romantic attachment, but we're wired for attachment and connection. We'll talk about that in a minute. We talk about the 5 relationships. And that's the way alcohol works, I think, and that's the way other intoxicating substances or behaviors work. They end up taking over that attachment role that's really designed for God, who made us for Him, and also designed for that intimate relationship in marriage in particular that we're designed for in God's created order. And instead it displaces God and displaces that mate that God might have for us. And so intoxication becomes a shadow spirituality that imitates God, and our attachment needs are met in a false way. And I'm just this is just kind of food for thought for you. So just thinking about this for a minute. Is there a relationship between intoxication in the Bible and spiritual phenomena? And you see in 1 Samuel 1 that you see Hannah is going before the tabernacle where Eli is, and she's praying to the Lord. And it says in verse 13, Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving in her heart, but her voice was not heard. And Eli, the high priest, thought she was drunk. And he said to her, how long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. So he's trying to bring moral correction to somebody he thinks is actually drunk and they're coming in to worship. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. There's a connection here between that role that being filled with wine or being filled with cocaine and how it makes us feel and what it's trying to fill up inside with what God's plan is for us to be filled up inside with Him. An independent, beautiful, loving attachment with Him. And so if you're filled up here, you get the idea, just a visual picture here. Hannah looks like, in the fact that she's, in a way, swept away with her relationship with God, an ecstatic experience with God as she's praying her heart out, praying her guts out. And it's mistaken for substance abuse in that case. And it shows you how close those are related, I think, in the way they work in the human heart sometimes. Acts 2, same kind of thing. On the day of Pentecost, the disciples are thought to have been drunk because of the way they're behaving. They thought they were high, but they were being filled by God in fulfillment of the prophet Joel's prophecy that God's people would be filled with His Spirit. And so if we begin to take a look at what the Scriptures teach us about intoxication and spirituality, we begin to see how intoxication can be confused with it, because it operates as a shadow spirituality sometimes. And even superficially, it can look like it. Ephesians 5, then, 16 and 18. Paul instructs us to be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. And therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but instead be filled with the Holy Spirit. So here you see a direct contrast between you can go get high through your addiction and base your life around it and form that attachment with it and think you get your needs met with it, but it just keeps sucking the life out of you. Or you can be filled with the Spirit and let God work in your life and embrace Him and attach to Him. So you see this contrast that's there. And that's the choice that as you're dealing with parishioners who are lost, they don't know how to get attached to God because the attachment's so strong over here with their addiction. So part of it is they've got to try and figure out how to unhook from their addiction. And then part of it is they've got to be able to surrender to God and be able to reconnect to Him and reconnect to those significant people God's placed in his or her life. And I thought this was a Baptist group, and so everybody should say. So, should Christians drink is a question you could come up with an answer to at the end of my presentation. And I'll just make these few points. Drunkenness is clearly condemned by Scripture as harmful on multiple levels. We ought to avoid intoxication. Okay, and we would certainly easily by analogy apply that across drug use as well. Responsible use of alcohol as a food and a mild medicine even is supported in the Bible. I think we've seen that from the passages we've seen. And therefore we have liberty in Christ. Prudent use of alcohol is okay. Drunkenness is not. Fourthly, Christians may differ on this issue, and there may be good reasons to abstain based on your personal views. Recently, I'm part of a web server for pastors in my denomination, and the topic of what do you do? Should people abstain or not abstain? And should churches have policies around that? And I don't think we have any churches in our fellowship that have policies, but there's some people who are concerned about are we slipping into kind of worldliness by not having policies that control certain behaviors and so on, or at least direct certain guidelines around behavior. It was very interesting because you found a wide diversity in the people who were responding. There were some who were very strong on abstinence, but in every case they would say, we can't come up with any kind of biblical basis for it, but in every case they came out of family systems where they saw the ravages of alcoholism and drug abuse firsthand, and they kind of said, I'm dead set against it for those reasons. And those are good reasons for them. Others would probably take a position, as we just outlined, saying it's really not prohibited by Scripture, so therefore I would be willing to consider using alcohol occasionally in a careful way. And others would say, I've got the liberty to do that, but I personally think I just would rather not use it because I don't need any more problems in my life than I've already got. And so they just made a principled decision on their own free choice to say, it's just something I don't need more of in my life. And so I think that there's going to be some differences sometimes that are dictated to us by our own personal history and background around this issue, and that's okay. Not everybody necessarily has to be in the same place. And for some people, it's extremely good to be abstinent. I would add this, and it's my number 4 here. I always try to have at least one of those in every presentation. Even responsible drinking may be the wrong thing in some contexts. And I think I would say this to you if you are a person that says, well, John, I've listened to this, but, I have no problem with this. I don't think the Bible says I can't drink it. I drink occasionally, and it's not a big deal. That's fine. But this last one, you ought to pay attention to. Because you know what? Do not use your liberty around this if it puts somebody else in jeopardy in certain situations. I've been dealing with a couple of Christian. He's a Christian cocaine addict, and they came to me initially, and he had been binging on cocaine. He'd been injecting cocaine, and it was a pretty big crisis. And I did assessment on him, and he finally got it. Maybe I'll tell you more about that tomorrow. That, pal, I've got a serious problem. About 3 weeks after I started working with this couple, they come in and they're arguing about what happened on the weekend. What happened on the weekend was they got together at a party with church friends. This kind of blows my mind. Maybe this is your everyday experience, but for me this is strange. I'm getting old. This is a young couple, about 30. And she's all mad. She's all mad because they had deliberately planned to go to a party with some other Christian friends on a Friday night, and it was his turn to be the designated driver. And as best I can understand, this party really involved kind of like celebration of liberty and mixed drinks and experimenting with new tasty concoctions, and it was his turn not to drink anything because he was going to drive home for them. And of course, he went there. He's a cocaine addict, and promptly had about 6-8 drinks and fell asleep on the floor. So much for his designated driver status. So they ended up staying there till like 3 in the morning before he kind of sobered up enough to drive home. And so she was all mad because it was unfair because she hadn't been able to go there and get blasted. And these are people from very conservative backgrounds originally. And I'm listening to this and I'm going, you know, your husband's an addict. What are you doing? In my opinion, the folks that they're hanging around with in that particular fellowship, they ought to re-examine the teachings of Paul in Romans and 1 Corinthians about what's smart to do, especially if you have a friend who's struggling with an addiction. They never should have gone to that party, but the folks at the party, if they're Christians, should have said, you know what, this isn't a fitting activity when we have a good friend who's struggling with substance abuse. That's abuse of liberty. And so I would say to you, if you are choosing to drink and use alcohol on a social basis, you have a responsibility to be aware of occasions when it genuinely isn't the right thing to do and say no to yourself in those occasions in a principled manner. You also have a responsibility to make sure that you're not abusing it so that you do not lapse into the kinds of problems that the Scriptures warn us about due to the misuse of alcohol. Now, we finished that section, and I'm going to have everybody just stand up. Okay, now please sit down. Or you can leave if you have to. That's fine. Yeah, all those who never had a drink, sit down. That's right. Yeah. Now, I made a promise to my friend Lee about how much time we were spending on this, but there's a lot in here to go through. But here's an executive decision I'll make to try to soften this, Lee. First of all, I want to say to you, if some of you have to go because you have other obligations, I totally understand that. So if any time you want to go, I might try to go to a quarter after. Is that okay? Yeah. I mean, that'll be up to whoever wants to stay for that.
We're normally done at 9 o'clock, and there's opportunity for interaction. And he asked me ahead of time, he said, I have a heavy agenda tonight, and we'll just say ahead of time that if you need to scoot, fair enough. And if you want to stay and do some of the interaction with him, that's fair enough as well. So feel very free. We're not offended by anything there. Thank you.
Okay. So having said that, there's another couple of pages here, and I'm just going to make a decision. Page 10 and page 11 in this handout, addicts or victims or sinners. I'll just make a brief comment. Linda Mercadante, and her name will be on a bibliography I'll distribute tomorrow night. She wrote a very fine book. She's a Presbyterian theologian called Victims and Sinners. And it's an excellent evaluation of the doctrine of sin as it relates to the 12 steps and AA culture. So if you want to learn more about that, that's a very good place to look. We're not going to talk too much about it. I would just say, along with our brother who opened our session, that sin's a good word. It's a good biblical term. It does describe addiction. But we have to think broader than the idea of simply sin as violations of God's commandments. We're missing the mark in that fashion because sin has many different levels of meaning in the New Testament. It also is kind of the sin principle that lives in me. It's not just particular acts. And it's also relates to the fallenness of the world that we live in. And so does sin affect us in addiction? Do we choose to sin sometimes? Are we also victims of sin by others in this fallen world? Yes, both those things are true. But without going much further on that, I refer you to Linda Mercadante's book, published by Abington in 1996, I believe. There's a list of issues that arise, again, coming from a Christian counseling perspective, relating to spirituality, internal and external movement for addiction recovery. I'm going to wait, and I'm going to cover that tomorrow night in my lecture. So I would like to move ahead and skip ahead to page 12, which is AA and appreciative critique. Some parts of this I'm going to go lighter on, and some parts I'm going to spend a little bit more time on. The history of AA and its Christian roots. As you know, in the mid-1930s, there was no real organized response to what to do with the problem of addiction to alcohol. And Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, two individuals who had been associated with a movement called the Moral Rearmament Movement, founded by a theologian named Frank Buchman, B-U-C-H-M-A-N, in Great Britain. He developed a system of small groups for renewal of the church that focused on the book of James in particular, but basic kind of first century Christianity is what they were all about. They talked about Jesus. They talked about the importance coming out of James about coming together and confessing one's sins to one another and bearing one another up and encouraging one another up and building community. These were strong emphases in the original moral rearmament movement, or what was called the Oxford Group, was another name for it. Well, Bill Wilson, before he found sobriety, actually was in and out of this Oxford Group movement in the East Coast in the United States. And so was Dr. Bob. And in fact, Bill Wilson, after he had his kind of transforming white light experience where he surrendered his life to a higher power, when he was on a business trip to Toledo, Ohio, what he did was he called the network of these meetings that were coming out of this Christian Oxford Group network, and he said, is there anybody that you know that happens to have a problem with drinking, because I've just quit drinking and I think that I need to talk to another alcoholic. And this was a surprising thing, and he got a lot of turndowns because people thought, well, what do you want to do? Get together and drink with them. That was the natural thing. But finally, what he did was he found a woman whose husband was hopelessly addicted to alcohol. And so Bill went to visit her as part of this network of the Moral Rearmament Oxford Group, and she introduced him to her husband, and then they talked and talked and talked. I think it was for about 18 hours solid. And that was the beginning. That was regarded as the first initial meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so Alcoholics Anonymous really has its roots in a Christian movement that was trying to restore some kind of a first century reality and authenticity in community coming out of Great Britain. As the principles of AA were developed primarily by Bill Wilson, but also Dr. Bob was involved in it too. And as Wilson wrote the big book, the Blue Book, and developed the 12 Steps, they had to make some decisions along the way, and Wilson advocated taking out some of the more distinctively Christian aspects of the 12 steps in order to make them more broadly applicable and less objectionable on sectarian grounds. And so any mention of Jesus or the Bible per se, they decided that they would not include in the 12 steps. However, the assumptions were broadly Christian because almost everybody involved was some kind of Christian. That was the assumption of the culture that spawned the 12-step movement. They got a lot of publicity fairly early on because they were actually answering the question, what can we do to help people who are struggling with the problem of alcoholism? And there were some dramatic turnarounds that were occurring as people began to try to work the program and so on. A turning point happened, I think it was around 1940, because they had kind of expected to become some sort of a moneyed operation at some point, and they had this great fundraising situation in New York with all these famous philanthropists who'd taken an interest in them. I think one of them was like a Rockefellers and so on. And they invited all these rich friends, and Wilson and Dr. Bob and everybody had put on this great presentation to show some of the life-changing things that had happened. And at the end of it, they were shocked because the leading philanthropist who was sponsoring them and invited all these rich friends stood up and said, you know what, this is so inspiring. I think it would be a shame to give any money to AA because it'll ruin it. It's all run by volunteers. And of course, at that time, Bill Wilson and the rest of the AAers in that early time just about died because that's what the whole point of the gathering was. But of course, as they began to look back on it, the guy was right. This thing was grassroots. It was run by people who cared. It was run by people who had the common problem together, who were taking responsibility for the organization. And so the self-help ethos of AA grew out of that turning point, if you would. And so today it's apart from General Services Administration, I think in New York City, I think this is fair to say, I don't think there's any paid employees. Everybody is a volunteer. I don't know if there are some regional folks who help out with office work, but that's about it. There's no head honchos. It's all run by volunteers, and that's part of the genius of AA and NA and the other related groups based in growing out of the 12 steps. So that's a little bit of the history of AA. It also got a boost from the Catholic Church fairly early on, since particularly the Catholic Church emphasized confession and other things. They particularly could grab hold of and appreciate, for example, the step 4, step 5 about taking a fearless moral inventory and sharing that with another person, and so on. Some of the benefits of AA, it's free, doesn't cost anything. You might pass a basket to see who would help pay for the rental of the room at the church or the Y or wherever it's happening. It's everywhere. You can find AA meetings in small communities, big communities. It's difficult to find any place of any size that doesn't have some AA meeting of some sort. There's a high degree of ownership involved in it because it's run by people who are recovering themselves. So there's a fairly high degree of authenticity in the room at AA meetings and NA meetings and Overeaters Anonymous and Gamblers Anonymous and the other types of 12-step meetings. There's many other advantages as well. And one of the advantages for us as Christians is that the emphasis on spirituality, which is so central to AA, is, I think, arguably compatible with evangelical Christianity with some provisos, as long as you understand that you're free to define God as you wish, but you cannot really tell other people what you believe about Jesus, and that's sometimes a restraint for us as believers. It's frustrating. But on the other hand, it's a place where you can truly talk about spirituality and what's going on for you. There are some limitations about AA's approach, and so that's part of this appreciative critique that's important. One of the problems that some people have cited is that in AA circles, it's very important to label oneself an addict or an alcoholic. So if you've ever, how many people have ever attended an AA or NA meeting? Okay, fair amount of folks here tonight. It's great. If you go and sit in an AA meeting, you introduce yourself and typically say, I'm an alcoholic, I'm an addict, I'm a gambling addict, et cetera, around the circle. some have said, particularly cognitive psychologists have said, it's not a particularly good thing, in their view, to take as a label on yourself your greatest problem. Say to take the thing that has caused you the most pain and has been a kind of a negative side of your character and say, that's my identity. They would argue, isn't such a good thing. Because in general, and I would probably say this as a cognitive trained therapist myself, I don't like to label myself. I try to label my behavior. And labels on myself, I think, need to be ones that are affirming and positive, not a negative type of label. So there's some concern about that. The other thing that I've experienced personally in trying to help people is that sometimes, when I worked at a treatment center that was 12-step based, there was a lot of emphasis in our group work on trying to get people to say, I'm an addict. Okay, and that was kind of, you're not getting it unless you say that. Or I'm an alcoholic. You've got to say that, or else. And my personal experience with folks is that sometimes by overemphasizing that, you actually create barriers for people because it has some stigma attached to it. And really, I don't care if you say you're an alcoholic or an addict. What I want to know is, do you think you got a problem? That's the key point there. And so and this is just, again, my personal practice. I don't care whether somebody says I'm an alcoholic or an addict. I just want to know that they're able to say, I've really got a problem. Now, when people get it, they quite often will come back to me and they say, okay, I think I'm an addict. But I don't have to put it on them or get involved in power struggles trying to make them say it. If they say it, I'm with them all the way, and I'm saying, if that helps you to say that, yeah, let's do that. The key there, so that's in a sense the good defense of accepting the label, is if you're accepting the label because it means problem identification, yeah, great. But sometimes insisting on it up front as a big deal might actually discourage them from talking to you, and you might actually be able to impact them and get them to look at themselves. I can think of this Christian cocaine addict I referred to, who was out shooting up cocaine, and he had thought he didn't really have a problem. He was a recreational drug user. And of course, by standards of cocaine users, he didn't have as bad a problem as a lot of people. He was only binging maybe once every 6 weeks. Well, that's not so bad when you look at the people down on the street in Hastings, East Hastings in Vancouver, where it's 24/7. And he kind of thought to his wife, she's overreacting. But when we went through some checklists and asked some questions and did an evaluation, he kind of had to evaluate himself. In the middle of the assessment time, he goes, whoa, I scored that? He says, you know what? I'm an addict. That was awesome for him. I didn't have to push him to say it. My attitude was, do you have a problem or not? And he came up with that, and that was great because he began to say, I've got to do something about my problem then. So labeling can be an issue sometimes. One of the other drawbacks is the idea of lifetime in recovery and the lifetime in group meetings. And as many spouses have had somebody go into recovery and they say, well, my husband used to be out drinking all the time, now he's out at meetings all the time. And then furthermore, he's told that his meetings are going to have to go on and on forever. That in fact, he's going to definitely die or relapse or not make it if he gives up on attending. And I would just say that the truth of the matter is some people make it without AA and those kinds of supports. There's a variety of ways people get into recovery. And so not everybody is going to stay in AA lifetime. Some people will do it and really work the 12 steps all the way for all the years. He talked about 40 years in recovery, I think, when we chatted and so on. And he's been strongly involved in the fellowship all that time. Other people will go and get some help for a year or so, or 2 years, and then they'll gradually taper off, and it won't be so significant. But when they're having problems, they'll check back in. So it's not. So the question is, does it have to be a lifetime allegiance? Some people would say absolutely yes, but some people feel uncomfortable with that. And then we mentioned this today in our meeting over at the church. Sometimes there's an anti-medication mentality that criticizes people for taking antidepressants and other things because the historic AA slogan of a drug is a drug is a drug sometimes isn't very nuanced about there may be legitimate places. If you're bipolar, you ought to take your lithium. Okay? If you don't take your lithium, chances are your sobriety isn't going to be making it either, and so on. I'll just make a couple of quick comments here about AA's effectiveness. One of the problems about AA is that does AA work? And the answer is absolutely for those people who will do it. But the problem with Alcoholics Anonymous is that there's a fairly high dropout rate. Let me give you the illustration. This is from AA's own triennial survey in the early 90s. If you recommended AA to 100 people on January 1st who were all alcohol dependent, on December 31st, how many are still attending AA? 10. 90% dropout rate. Out of the 10, 6 will have maintained sobriety with AA, and 4 will be struggling in and out, probably. Now, that's actually pretty good. What it says is, if you work that program, and if that's the program that's a good fit for you, about 60% of people will get really solid help there. And even those who don't get full recovery out of it, they're probably better off. They're probably drinking less, using less, okay? Because they're getting some benefit. But it reminds us that if we've got such a high dropout rate, is the problem, well, they're just not serious about the recovery? Or are some of those folks finding other paths to recovery? Are there other resources that people are using? And so I think that one of the things that's happened in the research on substance abuse treatment in the last 20 years, it's become increasing attention first on doing some better research on AA so we can understand the great benefits from it, but also developing additional strategies to help people. And that's really important. Because if you conclude, AA was originally formulated, if you look at the disease model that was developed by Jelinek at Yale, for example, in the early 60s, we wrote the book on the subject. He came up with 5 types of alcoholics, one of whom was called a gamma alcoholic. He named him after letters of the Greek alphabet. That's the 3rd letter of the Greek alphabet, Craig. And gamma alcoholics were folks who drank and exhibited a loss of control. Whenever they started to drink, they could not stop until they were totally toasted. And Jelinek classified that particular group. And in his book, he said, I think this is the group that probably would benefit most from Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, I think he's right. And that's why when we think about the disease model of AA, it very much fits that kind of notion that there's an inherent biological problem that leads always to loss of control, that it's a chronic progressive disease. The difficulty is there's some drawbacks with the disease model, and it doesn't fit the whole spectrum of alcoholisms, because actually alcoholism is not just one thing. It looks like a bunch of different things for some different people. There's binge patterns, there's different types of drinkers, and there's people who are only abusing alcohol who may not need to go to 12-step meetings forever because they do need help and intervention, but that may not be what they need. And there's other people who are in that addiction category who really need the structure and the work of the 12 steps very strongly. So I guess one thing I'm going to say to you tonight, we really need to be stopping very shortly. I got about 5 minutes left here before I said I'd be done. What I'm trying to encourage you there is to say zest for the 12 steps and AA, NA, and the family of fellowships that have developed out of there, because they're awesome resources. But also encourage you to think more broadly about lots of options for people as much as possible. The folks I see really getting the heck beat out of their addiction, who can really take their addiction on and beat it, are folks who do a variety of things. They may use some kind of small group type of interaction like AA, or a church-based group like Celebrate Recovery, or a men's support group for pornography, or some other type of group that helps them with their problem. But then they also may have a couples group at their church that gives them tremendous support. And for some people, if they're in that kind of community, they don't need as much some of the other types of support that a more isolated person might need in a 12-step group, for example. Having well-trained counselors who can do good substance abuse counseling, who are available to work on trauma issues and some of those deeper underlying factors, that might be another area that's needed to help. Having godly pastoral care with pastors who understand the dynamics of addictive thinking and how it affects a person spiritually and family-wise and socially and all the other impacts that it can have. And so what I would just advocate to you is that there isn't the answer. It's important to work multi-level when you're trying to help a person with a life-encompassing problem like an addiction. And the more multi-level stuff you get going, the better off they are, because it helps break down those old pathways. It helps break the association learning that's happened there, because you're bringing new input coming from different directions. And you can really help that person become transformed in so many ways through multiple options. There's a couple of notes here on the bottom of page 12, why AA works. It's again, AA does so many good things. It renews a person's mind by giving them different ways to look at things. We think about the slogans down there. Slogans and prayers, renewing the addicted mind. Easy does it is a great bumper sticker. I should have that on my tattooed on my forehead so I can calm down. But it's the idea of one day at a time, taking it easy, not looking too far ahead, lowering your anxiety, learning how to soothe yourself, calm yourself. The Serenity Prayer talks about acceptance of things instead of getting angry, upset, bitter, and so on. So the Lord's Prayer is widely practiced in many 12-step groups, even though otherwise it's not particularly necessarily overtly Christian. But that is one place where there's been a real tradition of holding on to a Christian prayer that, again, connects people to God. So many good benefits that fit the kinds of needs that people with addictions have. There are some questions sometimes for Christians, such as where's Jesus, and that the God of our understanding is not necessarily the God of Scripture. And does the disease model undermine personal responsibility? I would just say that the 12 steps, I think, in general are compatible with Christianity as long as you make sure that you are aware of why you're using them. And jumping down to the bottom of this page, recommendations regarding the use of AA. AA is a great line that I use all the time in my own life, and I tell my students this when they disagree with me. Use what fits and leave the rest. That's a great line. It's kind of that part of that easy does it. You don't have to agree with everything in something to find there's some benefits to it, some great benefits. And so when you think about AA as a Christian leader, and many folks are involved in the fellowship yourselves, for pastors here, clarify why you send people to AA. Do you send them there for theology or recovery? I once had a woman who was a crystal meth addict who I sent to NA. It was pretty funny. This is a woman who had done some pretty substantially bad things in her life. And I won't go through the list, but pretty bad. And so here she is. I'm trying to find social support for her. Send her to NA. She comes back and she says she's a Christian. She says, well, I don't want to go to that AA group. You know, she could sell her body. She could commit adultery. She could do all sorts of things. I don't want to go to AA group because those people swear. And you know, and you're going, you know, it's just like the same thing that happens after somebody comes out and they're in the treatment facility and they're refusing to take vitamins, and they've been using every drug in the book now for 10 years. They're refusing to take vitamins because they don't want to pollute their body. You know, it's the same kind of craziness. And I guess what I'm saying there is that with that woman that I just referred to, I say, well, I'm not sending you there for Sunday school. You know, I'm sending you there to listen and learn and get some help with your addiction because you're way out of control and you need all the help you can get. Okay. And so don't send somebody there primarily, first of all, to learn Christian doctrine because it's compatible with Christian worldview, I think, but it's not going to teach you like the church would. And you still need that from the church. So use it for what it's meant for, which is to help support your sobriety. Don't worry about what it's not going to do. You'll get that. Let's get that in place elsewhere in your recovery program. Maybe through mentoring with a godly Christian friend who can take some Christian standpoints on some issues that you're facing. Then also AA is a good resource, but not the only road, as I said, and it's not a lifetime for everybody, but it will be for some, and it'll be helpful along the way. And then AA groups vary in personality and design, so shop around for best fit. That's very important. If you're going to send somebody, try and recommend a couple of groups and try a couple times. Because sometimes you'll be there on an off night and it doesn't fit. But I've got a client right now who's going to NA, And it's really clicked with him. But he tried 2 or 3 groups, and some of them weren't so good. So he's found one that's kind of clicked, and he feels like it's his home group. Well, that's great. So just realize there's different personalities. Some of them accept smokers, some of them do not. Some of them are for women only, some of them are for men only. If you contact the AA main number that's here for the Maritimes, I think it is, I think it's located in Halifax, actually. There's a phone number, and I've got this on my list of references for you for tomorrow to distribute. You can always find out where the meetings are, what kind of meeting they are, and encourage people to try a couple to see which is a good fit if you're going to use that type of help. Well, the only thing I've skipped over here is some stuff about the disease model, and I'll just give you the bottom line on it. The disease model, strictly speaking, doesn't hold up. Okay, I've already mentioned it's not quite a unitary disease when you think about alcoholism. There's actually probably multiple kinds of alcoholisms that work together that look different. It's not always chronic. Some people stay stuck at a certain level of dysfunction, but they're fairly functional. They don't always, and sometimes they're able to quit without any help. I had a guy that was later addicted to some other stuff, but he managed to stop alcohol even though he's very dependent, totally on his own. He had no help. He didn't even use me. That was tragic. I felt sad about that. But people are quite resourceful, and they have natural ability sometimes to recover, depending on what kind of resources they have. So there's multiple ways to recover, and addiction is not always chronic, although it typically is. Now, having said that, let me make a caution here. Generally speaking, even behavioral science, even though there's some people seem to be able to back away from what would be called dependence and move towards more social drinking, that is a tiny slice of the human population. Okay? Very, very, very few people can return to any kind of recreational use of a substance once they are qualified as substance dependent. That's why even in the DSM-4 it says, if you've ever been diagnosed as substance dependent, you cannot be diagnosed in a lower degree. That is going to be your diagnosis, okay, in the future. You can't be seen as just abusing. And that's because of those neural pathways and those other things. So, having said that, there are some people who are probably in that abuse level that go back to some sort of lesser problem. But once you get into the far end, it's tough to do anything that relates to chemicals without getting re-addicted or cross-addicted. And if you know anybody that struggled with an addiction, they're often easily attracted to anything that's addictive once they've got that pleasure pathway lined out. And then the issue of loss of control, it's not exactly an instantaneous response biochemically. It also has to do with what your expectations are when you're drinking. We know sometimes people actually who have very high dependence in some social settings, if there's high expectations they won't drink, they can control themselves and not overdo it. However, that's a very limited time kind of thing and more of an experiment rather than an everyday life experience. Bottom line is are addictions to substances diseases in a literal medical sense? I think most people who are experts in addictions today would say probably doesn't fully qualify. But having said that, I'd say that generally in the field the consensus is that addiction as a disease is a useful metaphor because it's pretty clear that addiction operates kind of like a disease. And it helps capture that life-dominating and deep-rootedness aspect of addiction, which gives it so much power and mystery over people. Now, I have numerous people making secret hand gestures. Lee's almost out of his chair. He's going to fall over if he doesn't get up here. So thank you for your indulgence tonight and putting up with the lateness of the hour. Hope to see you back, and we'll talk about motivational interviewing, and we'll go over these spiritual movements that were in the handout tonight tomorrow evening.
Thank you very much, John. Appreciate that.